Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. My name is Marvin Schiff. I'm a member of the Toronto Workmen's Circle Foundation, the sponsors of today's program, and it's on behalf of the foundation that I have the honor to welcome you to this, our annual commemoration of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. Indeed, I'm particularly honored since this year marks the 80th anniversary of the outbreak of that historic battle for Jewish survival. The Warsaw Ghetto Uprising began on April 19, 1943, the first night of Pesach. But many of the Jews in the Warsaw Ghetto were not celebrating at Seder. Instead, as many accounts tell us, they were at battle stations, no doubt trembling with a mixture of dread and excitement as they trained their guns on the places where they expected soon to see Nazi soldiers entering the ghetto on a murderous mission to destroy it and the Jews imprisoned in it. Suddenly, a gunshot shattered the stillness of the evening, and a German soldier fell, the first casualty of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising against the brutal Nazi overlords. For the Jews, it was the beginning of a valiant fight for their culture, their freedom, their very lives, an epic battle that would become known as one of the most heroic in human history. But tragically, one that the Jews, poorly armed and greatly outnumbered, knew from the start they could not hope to win, and indeed, one they lost, paying a terrible price in Jewish lives. And so every year about this time, we gather to pay tribute to the people of the Warsaw Ghetto, to mark their incredibly courageous stand against their Nazi tormentors, and to acknowledge their last appeal to Jews around the world. Quote, "Remember us," they urged. "Let our departure from the world in ashes and smoke not be in vain." So yes, indeed, as they asked, we do remember. But is remembrance in itself enough? Clearly not, for vicious anti-Semitism is raising its ugly head again today and thriving even among liberal societies. So we must observe the second part of the legacy the heroes of the Warsaw Ghetto left for us. Jew and Jew alike, and Jew and non-Jew, must not let their departure from the world in ashes and smoke be in vain. We must take action against anti-Semitism and, together, all forms of race hatred.
Reißen, brennen und zerblasen, staubt am Hoch die eingeschlagen und die Bässe wipfeln unser Stern brennt. Und ihr steht und guckt so ihr mit verlegter Hand. Und ihr steht und guckt so ihr unser Stern brennt. Es brennt, Berenbaum, es brennt. Es kennt wohl jeder kommen der Moment. Unser Stück mit uns zusammen soll euch schon weg in Flammen bleiben, so wie noch erschlammt, noch kusst der schwarze Wind. Und ihr steht und guckt so ihr mit verlegter Hand. Und ihr steht und guckt so ihr unser Stern brennt. Es brennt, Berenbaum, es brennt. Die Hilfe ist nur in euch allein gewählt. Und der Städtel ist euch teuer, nehmt die Kinder, löscht das Feuer, löscht mit euer eigenem Blut, beweist, dass ihr das kennt. Steht nicht bei der Unter, so ihr mit verlegter Hand. Steht nicht bei der, löscht das Feuer, unser Stern brennt.
Elne kommes, Haynt is yortsayt. Yortsayt, Haynt, a Zind. Wenn gerufen hat zu dir ein erstgeboren Kind. Haynt is yortsayt noch ein Schmeichel über Wald und Plain. Jeder hat Haynt yortsayt, noch sein Schwell, noch sich allein. Haynt is yortsayt noch ein Regen 1943, noch ein letzten Karschenbäum und Schwellballe dabei. Haynt is yortsayt noch mein Zeit, verfreuren in Ponar. Haynt is yortsayt noch mein Mames gelben Samovar. Noch ein Schnee von meiner Weißlein ausgeschneit, beschaß ich hab zugedeckt mit dem Kever von mein Gas. Haynt is yortsayt noch die 2 Malochen bei mein Bett. Haynt is yortsayt noch ein Zoffenstern ergetät. Yortsayt noch ein Spiegel mit einem blauen Teich im Rahmen, wo es bäumten sich die Licht und Schottens von mein Stamm. Haynt is yortsayt noch ein Schabbes, rein wie ein Brillant. Haynt is yortsayt noch der Fiddle in mein Chavers Hand. Haynt is yortsayt noch ein Leib in Friedigen und Bläus. Haynt is yortsayt noch der letzte Yortsayt Licht in Kleus. Yortsayt noch einen langen Säger auf der Wand von Lehm. Oi, noch alle Wieglieder von unser Irrwe ein.
Today is yortsayt. God of vengeance, today is yortsayt. Today we mourn the day you were summoned by your firstborn. Today we mourn a smile which covered dell and wood. Today we mourn ourselves, our home and neighborhood. Today I mourn the rain in 1943, the last little swallow in the nearby cherry tree. Today I mark my time frozen in Pinar. Today I remember my mama's yellow samovar. The snow which the whites of my eyes have shed, and which covered my street, now the graves of my dead. Today I mourn the 2 angels by my bed, and the North Star somewhere overhead. I mourn the mirror with its lake blue frame, where bathe the light and shadows of my roots, my name. Today I mourn a Sabbath pristine and grand. Today I mourn the fiddle in my comrade's hand. Yortsayt for a body joyously in bloom, and for the last votive in the shul's small room. It's yortsayt for the tall clock upon the whitewashed wall, and for every lullaby of generations all.
A summons to remember. On the first Seder night in April 1943, the Jews in the Warsaw Ghetto took up arms against their Nazi overlords. It was the beginning of an epic battle, not for victory, as the resistance fighters knew from the outset, but for the honor of their people. On the walls of the ghetto, they posted an 11th commandment: "Thou shalt not despair." It was their watchword and their legacy. When the battle was near its end, the few Jews who still survived issued an appeal to their brethren around the world. Remember us. Do not forget what we have suffered at the hands of our murderous enemy. Let our departure from the world in ashes and in smoke not be in vain. The Battle of the Ghetto glows in Jewish history. It is immortalized in scores of writings and sanctified in the annals of the human spirit. It has nourished the will of new generations to renew and fortify their national and cultural heritage. We will forever remember the fighters who fell in the Warsaw Ghetto.
Heylik, Heylik, 10-mal Heylik seinen See in unser Zar. See, was liegen umzuteilig den Treblinke und Ponar. See, was seinen umgekommen in Retziche und in Spott, zärtlendig auf sehr Gummen, dem verschämten Nomen Gott. Zum Teut gegangen willig, ausgeschöpft Bein und Heut, wie es wollt nicht sein, kein Heylik, welcher Weg es führt zum Teut. Was heißt Leben in der Ghetto? Wer von dem weiß Haynt dem Teitsch? Nacht mit meisten Mäusgebette, Tag und Schein in Pein verbeitscht, ausgeschmiert in Blut und Tränen in dem Schotten von dem Teut, hat man kinderlach gelernt, Hilf gebracht, zu die in Neut. Jeder eine hat gegeben Hilf und Preis den Teutentoll, weil zu leben, überleben, ist gewesen der Parol. Was heißt in der Ghetto leben? Weißt wer Haynt dem Teitsch von dem? Als ein schwarzer Teut daneben hat Eisleisung gewähnt. Als strikt zusammen Kappel hat gemoniert und geschleppt. Doch hat man den Weg gezappelt, sich gemattert und gelebt. Und darüber komm ich melden und erklären, jung und alt, als gelebt hat man wie Helden, nicht nur kämpfendig im Wald, weil den Ghetto überkommen bloß ein Tag in Zwang und Gewalt hat gefordert mehr am Mune, wie zu sein ein Jahr im Wald. Und darüber lassen wir beugen unser Kopf, verseh ins Haar, und mit Tränen in die Augen sich der Monnen sehr gesah. Und nicht losen, aber wemmen, was ist nicht gewesen dort, sehr Heiligkeit verschämen mit nicht ein abgehitten Wort. Weiß, als nicht nur mit Gewehren kann man leben wie Held, euch in Schweiß, in Blut und Tränen kann man sterben wie Held.
Zygelboim was elected to the Warsaw City Council in 1927. During the first months of the Nazi occupation in Poland, he was a key figure in the underground resistance movement in Warsaw. He was sent to Europe and North America to raise awareness of what was happening to the Jews of Poland. However, his audience was incredulous or indifferent. Even as the Nazis were liquidating the Warsaw Ghetto, his pleas fell on deaf ears. 2023 is the 80th anniversary of his death and his final testament on behalf of our people. Ich kann nicht bleiben still. Ich kann nicht leben, wenn die Rechtler von jüdischen Volk in Polen, demens Vorsteher ich bin, werden umgebracht. Meine Chaverim in Warsaw Ghetto seien umgekommen mit Gewehr in Hand in dem letzten heroischen Gerangel. Ich gehöre zu sie und sehr Massenquoren. Mit mein Tod will ich ausdrücken dem stärksten Protest gegen der Passivkeit, mit welcher die Welt guckt sich zu und erlässt die Ausrottung vom jüdischen Volk. Mein Leben gehört zum jüdischen Volk in Polen und dafür gebe ich es ihm weg.
When was it sealed? When was it decreed, your great, your wonderful, deathless deed? Did it come to you like a child in your dream? Or did a dark messenger bring you the tale in your London exile? Did the messenger come to your door and knock, a woman heavily shrouded in black? I come from the Warsaw Ghetto where the earth is on fire, her clothes in rags, a tattered shroud and her lips red with blood. Then you knocked at doors and found hearts that were closed. You tried to rouse them, but they wouldn't be roused. What people are those who refused to listen when children were gassed and flung on the mound and no one raised a hand? You carried round stacks of papers to show. You may be right, they said, but how can we know? We want to believe you, but these are not facts, and we are bound by conventions and acts. You brought out a list of the dead. How can you prove they are dead, they say. So to convince them, you added your name to the list. You always gave proofs like a realist. One May night when the orchards ripened in the land and spring walked around with stars hand in hand, one window in a London street showed a light. That was you sitting down alone to write. You wrote your last letters and your last testament for the dawn to read before the night was spent. Then a shot rang out, a single shot to wipe out the shame of which you wrote. You died to make the world listen to the cry from the Warsaw Ghetto across the sky.
Unter die polishe grininke beymelekh spielen sich mehr nit keyn moyshelech shloimelech spielen sich mehr nit keyn sorelech leelech nit auf kein greiselech nit auf kein schneelech Schilchen schein mehr nit die jüdische Stiemelech von die Kundes im Lech, Motelech, Schiemelech, mit die zerkrellte, zidrapete Zurelech, von dem Beweisen, von der ihm und Gwurelech. Streuer natzint, die polische beymelekh toit seinen jiddische heimen und himlech toit seinen gesselech choref die heiselech wo es verstechen sich Kinder wie heiselech jiddische Kinder mit große Egelech schwarze Hasoi wie mit Heuschech verzeugene Egele volle mit Pachet verlaufen unter dem Unglück dem bräunem getroffenen unter die polische grininke beymelekh spielten sich mehr nit kein moyshelech shloimelech spielten sich mehr nit kein sorelech leelech nit auf kein greiselech nit auf kein schnee
Ladies and gentlemen, as you may have noticed, although we greatly appreciate their contributions, we have not introduced the readers or musicians participating in this program, nor will we. The point being to maintain a tone of commemoration and solemnity appropriate to the occasion. But we do introduce our guest speakers, whom we invite for the special knowledge and analyses they can share with us from their own profound study of and experience with the Warsaw Ghetto saga. And this year, especially given that this is the 80th anniversary of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, we're particularly honored to welcome one of today's foremost scholars of Jewish history, especially for our purposes, Warsaw Ghetto history, Professor Michael Berenbaum of the AJU, the American Jewish University. Now, I certainly wouldn't be surprised to learn that you may have encountered Dr. Berenbaum before, for he is a prolific writer, lecturer, and educator. He's the director of the AJU's Sigi Ziering Institute, dedicated to exploring the ethical and religious implications of the Holocaust. Among his many other honors and accomplishments, far too many to enumerate here, Dr. Berenbaum was the executive editor of the 1972 award-winning second edition of the Encyclopedia Judaica. He served as deputy director of the U.S. President's Commission on the Holocaust and authored its report to the president. He has taught at prestigious universities around the world, delivered widely acclaimed public lectures, written, co-authored, or edited many critically acclaimed books, and consulted on the conceptual development of museums and advised on the production of historical films. Now, I could go on for quite some time and still not cover our speaker's extraordinary list of achievements, so may I instead present the man himself, Dr. Michael Berenbaum.
Thank you very much for this opportunity to speak to you about the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. Let me begin by giving you a little bit of background about ghettos and a little bit of background about what happened preceding the uprising, and then we'll talk about the nature of resistance, and then we'll talk about the uprising. If you want to understand the history of the Holocaust, you have to understand what happened with the moment that Germany invaded Poland and the processes involved. You have to essentially learn 4 words: invasion, ghettoization, deportation, death camp. Germany invaded on September 1, 1939. The Soviet Union invaded from the east on September 17th, 1939. They bifurcated and they divided Poland along the Bug River. Within the German-controlled territories, and notice I'm using German instead of Nazi-controlled territories because the army was an active state and also occupation was a formal act of state, both as a technical and as a legal matter. Within the areas of German occupation, within a period of time, there was a decision to isolate, segregate, and contain the Jews. The modality of isolation, segregation, containment was ghettoization, but we shouldn't think of ghetto in American term or in terms of the Black ghetto, etc. We have to think of ghettoization in terms of what happened in German-occupied Poland. For the Jews, the ghetto was a way of living until. They had no idea what the until represented. They dreamed that it would be until Germany came to its senses, until the Allies defeated Germany, or until the end of the war, whatever that represented. For the Germans, the ghetto was a way to segregate and isolate the Jews until, and at the very beginning, they too did not know until what. In retrospect, but only in retrospect, Ghettoization for the Germans became a way to segregate, isolate, and contain the Jews until a decision was made as to what to do with the Jews, and the infrastructure was built for their ultimate annihilation, what the Germans called extermination. For the Jews, ghettoization, because it was a way to live until, ultimately became a way of life. And that had what we shall call 4 stages. The first stage was the initial stage in which, ironically, because ghettos were established in the poorest sections of the neighborhood, of the city, in which Jews had to move in from wherever else they lived, find a place to live, find a way of transporting whatever they could. And ironically, the poor were the people who were not displaced. The rich tended to be the people who were displaced because they came from their section of the city to the section that was described as a ghetto. After the initial setting in, there was the question of the interim, and the interim period of time in which you settle in and you struggle to survive. You struggle to survive to have food for your family. You struggle to survive under conditions in which your health is challenged, in which there are epidemics and isolation. And you also struggle to survive spiritually in a world that is created to demoralize and dehumanize you. Therefore, the Jews did many different things as part of that process. The third stage of the ghetto was when the rumor came that there were going to be deportations, and you understood that the ghetto would be a very temporary phenomenon, and that's the moment at which you had to decide what to do, including that's the moment that some Jews chose to hide. If you lived in a geographical territory that was adjacent to forests, you chose to go to the forest, understanding that life there would be tough. And then the final stage of the ghetto was deportation, which we'll talk about in specifics with regard to Warsaw and to Poland itself. For the Germans, the decision was made that there would be the quotation marks final solution to the Jewish problem. Sometime that decision was made in 1941. And then the first stage of killing occurred in Soviet-occupied territories after Germany occupied the Soviet Union. That's what we called mobile killing units, what we call the Holocaust by bullets, in which essentially you sent mobile victims to stationary victims. You rounded them up, you brought them to a valley, to a wadi. You shot them one by one, village by village, town by town, hamlet by hamlet, men, women, and children. That became difficult for the killers, and there's tremendous amount of documentation about the way the killers needed alcohol afterwards. Gradually, they needed alcohol before and sometimes even during. Some had mental breakdowns, and it was emotionally tough on the killers, but let's not feel too much sympathy for that. The process then became reversed. And the process was that essentially, instead of making the killers mobile and the victims stationary, the victims would be made mobile and the killing centers stationary. And making the victims mobile meant that the killing centers were built adjacent to major railroad tracks. And killing centers operated with a minimum of human intervention and a maximum of what we would call the assembly line process of death. Let's take a look now at Warsaw in particular. Stage one, 1/3 of the population of Warsaw was moved into 2% of its space. So essentially, the ghettoization of Jews in Warsaw meant that there were a tremendous growth of human beings per square inch. And there were, for example, at its peak, 9.1 persons to a room, which meant that life in the Warsaw Ghetto was enormously difficult. Put it mildly, it was enormously difficult. Let's give one statistic. The death ratio in 1941, before there was any systematic killing, was 1 in 10. The death ratio in early 1942, before the Great Deportation, was 2 in 10. 1 in 5 people died of starvation, malnutrition, despair, and the like. That doesn't mean there wasn't life in the ghetto. Historians will want to say that there were 3 forms of resistance that preceded armed resistance. First is what we call symbolic resistance, the attempt to remain human in an inhumane situation. That could represent itself by everything from a person who chose to wash not because they could get clean, but merely to remind themselves that they once washed. For religious Jews, that meant prayer. For other Jews, it meant that you educated your children and you had school. For others, it meant that there was music and literature and lectures and an intellectual life. All of that was symbolic resistance. The second type of resistance was polemical resistance. Polemical resistance involved everything from graffiti to diaries, from memoirs to the gathering of archives like Emanuel Ringelblum did. Polemical resistance could also mean humor. So let's use a very simple example. A child was asked in the Warsaw Ghetto, what would you like most of all if you were Hitler's son? And he said, and the Yiddish is even better than the English, he said, I'd like to be an orphan. Ich will sein Yosem. I'd like to be an orphan. So in his imagination, he killed Hitler and imagined what the world would be without it. Humor was a tool. It's always a tool of the oppressed. But Jews continued to write. They continued to publish newspapers underground. They continued to leaflet. They continued to use graffiti to spray paint. They issued proclamations. They wrote letters. They wrote memoirs. And Emanuel Ringelblum gathered the archival material, not believing that he would survive, but believing that Jewish history would survive, and wanting to give the Jews the opportunity to write history from the perspective of the people inside the ghetto, not from the victors, the Nazis, who were controlling the ghetto. The last form of resistance was self-help. And Jews were masterful at self-help, everything from kitchens to charity drives, everything from attempts to create industry and to help each other survive the onslaught that was facing them. In Warsaw, the third stage was the impending rumor of deportation. And the rumor of deportation meant that some people fled to the Aryan side. Some people gave away their children, understanding they could not protect their children, and also understanding that they would be far more vulnerable in the quest for survival if they had children, especially young children. And then in Warsaw, you had the Great Deportation. Let me put the deportation on a Jewish calendar. Between Tisha B'Av and Yom Kippur, between the 23rd of July, 1942, and the 21st of September, 1942, 265,000 Jews were transported to Treblinka. Treblinka opened on July 22nd. July 23rd, it began receiving the first train from the Warsaw Ghetto. And between the 23rd of July and the 21st of September, more than 250,000 Jews, 265,000 Jews were transported, train after train after train, and 99.99% of them were dead within hours of arrival. This led the ghetto to enormous shock. The enormous shock was that, first of all, the very young had left, the old had left, the weak had left, the sick had left. And the ghetto consisted very often of isolated men and women, relatively speaking, young and healthy, who were profoundly depressed, had lost everything that meant something, had lost most things that meant something to them. And they were left and asked the question, why did we not resist? Why didn't we not put up a fight? Why did we report to go to the trains? There's an example. Also, they learned what Treblinka was. How did they learn what Treblinka was? There was a man by the name of Zygmunt Freilich. And I know I'm speaking to the Jewish Labor Committee. Zygmunt Freilich was very close to the train union, and he boarded a train posing as a conductor and went to Malinka, which was the station just outside of Treblinka. And he looked around and he asked the people that he met, the engineers and the other conductors, he asked them, tell me what's happening. And they gave him the following information. Trains are arriving every day. They're coming in loaded, they're going back empty. No no food has been delivered to the camp. No wells have been dug. And the camp is eerily silent at night. He then asked the question, how am I to know what really happens there? We now know how to interpret that data because that meant there was mass murder. And they said to him, breathe deeply, and the smell of human bodies burning has a unique odor to it that survivors of Auschwitz and other camps always reported on, and that he reported. He came back to Warsaw, and then they had not rumor, but they had knowledge of what was happening. That's the moment at which the Organization for Resistance began. So resistance was not a decision as to how to live, but a decision what to do with the remaining hours of your life and what to do also in the face of impending death. And that was the decision not to go idly and not to go quietly to one's death. Jews faced enormous handicaps in their fight for resistance. Number one, Jews had very few arms. So they sent Aryan-looking women in particular, and some Aryan-looking men to the non-ghetto side of Warsaw, to the Aryan side of Warsaw, to purchase arms. They had information about death, they had to purchase arms, and they had to see if they could get arms, and they had to smuggle the arms into the ghetto. And then they had to organize the resistance. And then one other thing handicapped it enormously, which is that Jews could not agree on what the future would bring. So, for example, right-wing Zionists could not agree with left-wing Zionists. The left-wing Zionists formed an alliance with the Bund, but the right-wing Zionists would not join that. Some of them had had military training, and they wanted essentially to develop a strategy, not for a last stand, but a strategy that would include the ability to get out of the ghetto in the aftermath, and they could not agree on a joint command. So even in the Warsaw Ghetto, even with an enemy bent on the annihilation of the entire Jewish people, men, women, and children, Jews could not form one army. They did form two, the ZZW and the ZOB. And as they formed two, they wrestled with each other and did not coordinate with each other. Their first task was to organize the ghetto. And the ZOB issued a proclamation, Jewish masters, the hour is drawing near. You must be prepared to resist. Not a single Jew should go to the railroad cars. Those who are unable to put up an active resistance should resist passively, should go into hiding. Our slogan must be, all are ready to die as human beings, and that means without submitting to the Germans. On January 9th, Heinrich Himmler visited the Warsaw Ghetto. He ordered the deportation of another 8,000 Jews. Deportation caught Jews by surprise, and Jews made use of the many hiding places they had created since July. They did not report as ordered, and the resistance sprang into action. There were battles in the street near the Umschlagplatz, the transition point for deportation, and in buildings. Open battles were costly for Jewish fighters. Many were in hallways, became dangerous and they tried to. Partisan tactics proved more effective. Dark, narrow hallways became dangerous to Germans, and Jewish fighters could strike quickly, then escape across the rooftops. German troops moved cautiously. The Jews knew the ghettos. The Germans did not. They would not go down to cellars. The German action ended within a few days. And the Jews misinterpreted that as believing that they had routed the enemy, instead of understanding that there had been merely a cleansing action taking place. One ZOB leader said, "We saw ourselves as a Jewish underground whose fate was tragic. We were the first to fight, for our hour had come without any sign of hope or rescue. None from the outside, from the Allied armies, nobody dropped supplies, and none even from the rest of the Polish people." There's the famous, we're going to get to it, the famous poem by Miloszko, The Carousel. The uprising began on April 19th, 1943. April 19th is a very important day because April 19th represented for the Jews Pesach, the holiday of liberation. For the Germans, it was the eve of Hitler's 54th birthday, which was April 20th, the day that they wanted to present Adolf Hitler with a gift of a Judenrein, of a Jew-free Warsaw. The Germans had surrounded the ghetto. They had surrounded the ghetto with Ukrainian troops. The inhabitants of the ghetto were alerted immediately. Within 15 minutes, the ZOB forces were in position. Cellars turned into makeshift fortresses. At 6 a.m., the Germans launched the attack, and the ZOB had a small arsenal of handguns and rifles, a few machine guns, homemade Molotov cocktails. And Samarin's troops were routed by 7:30. There were casualties on both sides. The Jewish fighters were exhilarated. The Germans were suddenly vulnerable to attack. It seemed that German supermen were forced to retreat from the ghetto. Sylvia Lebetkin, one of the resistance fighters, who was then a very young woman, he said, recalled, when the Germans came to our post and marched by, we threw hand grenades and bombs and saw German blood pouring over the streets of Warsaw. There was much rejoicing. The tomorrow did not worry us. The rejoicing among the Jewish fighters was great, and see the wonder and miracles of those German heroes retreated, afraid, terrorized from Jewish hands. On April 20th, the Germans attacked the factory area where ZOB squads were stationed. The Jews set off a mine, forcing the Germans to retreat again. When they reappeared, the Jews fought again. This was followed by hand-to-hand combat. The Germans raised a white flag requesting a 15-minute truce. The Jewish response was a volley of fire. They tightened the siege of the ghetto. Electricity, water, and gas were cut off. Police dogs were brought in to uncover shelters where fighters were hiding. On the third day, the tactics shifted. The Germans no longer entered the ghetto in large groups, but roamed through the ghetto in small bands. Resistance forces of men and women also broke into small mobile cars. The commander was replaced by a general called Jürgen Stroop, who had taken over command. He decided on a new strategy. The ghetto was to be burned building by building, block by block. He wrote The fire that raged all night drove Jews who, despite all search operation, were still hiding on roofs and cellars and other hiding places. Scores of burning Jews jumped from the windows and tried to slide down the sheets. We took pains to ensure that those Jews, as well as others, were wiped out immediately. The Germans had planned to liquidate, to get rid of the ghetto in 3 days. The Jews held out for more than a month, and there was scattered fighting for much longer. When we say the Jews held out for more than a month, it means something else. It means Jews held out longer than the armies of France, longer than the armies of Belgium, longer than some of the major armies of Europe. They held out fighting on their territory, one by one by one. Fighters succeeded in hiding sewers, and even though the Germans tried first to flood the sewers and then to smoke them out with small bombs, some Jews escaped to the sewers. The Warsaw Ghetto Uprising was nothing less than a revolution in Jewish history. Jews resisted the Nazis with armed force. The significance and symbolic resistance of the uprising went far beyond the numbers of those who fought. Those who were part of it fully understood what it meant. Mordechai Analevich, the 24-year-old commander of the ZOB, wrote to Yitzhak Zuckerman, a unit commander, "What we experienced cannot be described in words. We are aware of one thing only. What has happened has exceeded our dreams. The Germans ran twice from the ghetto. I have the feeling that great things are happening, that what we have dared is of great importance." He then writes personally, understanding that he's going to face death. "Keep well, my dear. Perhaps we shall meet again, but what really matters is the dream of my lifetime has become true. Jewish self-defense in the Warsaw Ghetto has become a fact. Jewish armed resistance and retaliation have become a reality. I have been witness to the magnificent heroic struggle of the Jewish fighters." On May 8th, the Germans sent gas inside the bunkers at ZOB headquarters at Miller 18. Aryeh Vilna, young resistance fighters, shouted, "Come, let us destroy ourselves, let us not fall into their hands." Suicides began, pistols jammed, their owners begged friends to kill them, but apparently no one dared to take the life of a comrade. Someone discovered a hidden exit, but only a few succeeded in escaping. The others suffocated. As the Germans carried out the plan to set the ghetto aflame, some Jews escaped through the sewers and searched the hiding places on the Polish side. A survivor reported, "On May 10th at 9 o'clock in the morning, the lid of the sewer over our heads literally opened up and a flood of sunlight streamed into the sewer. At the opening of the sewer, Krasik, a member of the Polish resistance, was standing, calling all to come out. We started to climb out one after another, and once we got on the truck, it was a beautiful spring day. The sun warmed us. Our eyes were blinded by the bright light. We had not seen daylight for many weeks, and had spent time in complete darkness. The streets were crowded with people, and everybody stood still and watched, while strange human beings, hardly recognized as human beings, crawled from the sewers." Some aspects of the Warsaw Ghetto were common to all insurrections. Resistance leaders were young. They did not have responsibility for young children or aging parents. The resistance leaders knew that Treblinka meant certain death, and consequently, because it meant certain death, they had nothing left to lose. Resistance came to an end when all hope for survival was abandoned, and when trust in Jewish council leadership and its strategy of quiet acquiescence had ended. There was no longer a choice between life and death, but the question was, how do we behave with honor to the very end? The choice was to die fighting and to inflict casualties on the enemy. Jewish fighters faced overwhelming superior forces. The German figures reported the battle reflect the mismatch. Of the Jews captured, 7,000 were shot, 7,000 were transported to Treblinka, some 42,000 were sent to Majdanek and to forced labor at Travniki. 9 rifles, 59 pistols, 700 grenades and explosives were captured. Among the Germans and their collaborators, the losses were 16 dead, 85 wounded. The ghetto was in ruins. The figures, by the way, of the Germans were absolutely minimized and don't tell the real truth. One survivor said, if the streets, you can call them the streets, there was no room to go around. Besides fighting the Germans, we fought hunger and thirst. We had no contact with the outside world. We were completely isolated. Yitzhak Zuckerman, known by his nickname Antik, was recognized as a hero for his efforts. His heroism was of little comfort. He told Claude Lanzmann, I began drinking after the war. It was very difficult. Claude, if you ask me my impression, if you could look my heart, it would poison you. And these are the words of a hero. These are the words of a man who saw himself as a leader of the resistance and yet paid a deep and profound price for all that he experienced. The Warsaw Ghetto resistance represents a moment in Jewish history when the tide had turned and the Jews decided that they had to fight. They fought, as they said, for their dignity and honor, and for the dignity and honor of the Polish people as well. And their memory represents a turning point in Jewish history, a movement away from passivity into active armed resistance that is regarded by the Israelis as a symbol of the fact that they must be powerful, and was regarded as by all Jews as a symbol of courage and defiance, and as something that represents the ability to shape not whether you're going to live or die, but how you're going to live and how you're going to die. Thank you.
Die Bix ist nicht gewesen der Träum von seiner Nacht und nicht von seiner Tag der Sivik und Bescheid. Nos hat der Heuben sie zu jener größer Schar von Volk, von eigenem, die Kedusche und die Leid. So hat sie Schritt begleit als Sockens letzter Blick, so hat sie behielt bewacht am Mutters letzte Träer und seine Hand geboren ist gebencht mit Keuch und Haft, und sie sah Fläschelnaft gewinn, das grausamste Gewehr. Von der Yeshivas seien sie gekommen, von Droh, von Hechalutz, von Medemschulen, von Fabriken und Werkstätten, Kinder, was noch Nächten haben sich gespielt in Samt, alte Leid, was haben schon gehabt, Tachrichem zugegräht. Jetzt haben sich gelernt werfen Ziegel und Granaten. Und alles herum ist so fremd und säunedig und weiß. A viele in Kraschinskis Park, von jener Seite von Meuer, während die grüne Bäume wie mundierte SS-Leid stehen auf der Wache herum dem Ghetto teuer. Und alles verrot, die Schein, der Wind, die Nacht, der Schochen. Und Judas ist a jede Gas, a jede Schwell und Stein, was war verkäuft, für 30 Silberling zum Mörder, dein Mammen und dein Schwester, dein Träum und dein Gewehen. Hat mehr zu keinem nicht gehaft, nicht auf gar nicht mehr gewahrt. Wenn's hat verklungen zu der Welt der letzte SOS, und wenn's hat keiner nicht geämpft auf den letzten Ruf, hat aufgeflammt durch Blut, durch eigenem der Ness. Bloß zu der Meirewseit, zum Misrachseit, zu Zoffen und zu Dorm hat man sich gewendet in jener Schau von Einsamkeit und Neud. Wie einzukarben die zerbeuen Himmel, Stein und Bäum. Wir alle gehen sich frei, mit Schadach sein, mit Teut. Der Brand von Geto hat versenkt die Wies von der Sonne. Sie soll die Augen nicht verdecken, nur sehen, als müssen sehen und müssen Eide sagen, Jahr nach Jahr, von Dor zu Dor. In jener Tag, auf dem Ort, also ist es geschehen. Nicht doch kein Wort, was soll Gott auf eine Rege, sie können Oyfn zurück von jener Heuch. Von dort, wo sie die Eingewickelte in Flammen, die Eingewickelte in Pfannen und in Räuch, haben zum letzten Mal gebencht die Erde mit offenem, mit jednem Blick und Himmeln aufgeprallt wie teuren zu Glück. Nicht doch kein Wort, was soll sie Oyfn zurück? Nur du, mein Herz, ob kennst du, geh sie noch, und wer war seiner letzten Träum, der Hemmschach und die Weg.
Let us remember our brothers and sisters, their cities and villages, the town's noisy streets, the lonely village inn, the distinguished old man, a young girl with her braids, an infant, all of the Jewish communities with their thousands of families, a whole Jewish existence sentenced to death on the European continent by the Nazi executioner. The sudden outcry of a man who died, the woman who cradled her baby till her arms dropped, the infant seeking its mother's breast when it was cold and blue, the feet, those feet trying to escape but could not, fists full of steel, the steel becoming weapons of despair, visions, and rebellion. Those heroes of the heart, open-eyed, daring, gave their lives, but could not gain a victory. Let us remember the day at noontime when the sun gazed down on the slaughter from high in the silent sky. Let us remember the pile of ashes under the blossoming gardens and the dead who stare at us. They look from all sides, calling out for revenge. And let us, with our lives, bear witness and be their memorial.
Farvos ist der Himmel gewesen, Reuter von Frieden hat gescheint, Erde gab's. Farvos
Ich zünd mein Treuer wie Yortzeitlichter, noch eich martierer, heilige Gesichter, Yortzeitlich noch mein Heim. Wie die Kedoshim, ihr seid gestorben. Mit euch wird leuchten unser Morgen, ihr wird keinmal nicht vergehen. Wie der Phönix von die Stäuben, von Asch sich wieder aufgehäuben, so wird ihr aufgehen. Von die Oyfns, von die Flammen, von dritten Hurben aufgestanden, mein Volk wird nicht vergehen. Du, mein Kind, du wirst mich erben. Ein Volk darf leben und nicht sterben. Ich schreibe für dir das Lied. Du sollst dem vor dem weiter spinnen. Mein Volk soll wachsen und soll grinen. Gedenk, du bist der Jid. Du, mein Kind, von Stamm a Zweigel. Vor mein Dor du sollst, nicht schweigen. Gedenk die Nazi-Schlang. Unser Volk wird sich zerzweigen, mit neuer Gewürge widersteigen in sein Heldengang.
Es zieht sich durch endlose Deures und zieht, der gewaltige Völkergeschleck. Es zittert das Schlachtfeld mir unter die Tritt, ich gehe mir als weiter mein Weg. Durch Samt und durch Derner, durch Stein und durch Bein, ich geh und ich will noch ausgehen. Ich hab mit den Sotten Hamaschkes allein geschlossen an ewigen Bund. Das Feuer, es soll mich nicht brennen. Das Wasser, es soll mich nicht schlingen. Der Spie soll mich stechen nicht kennen. Die Keul soll zurück von mir springen. Ich fühl, ich bin stärker von allen Jesuren, von menschlicher Beiskeit und Streit, und stärker von Wasser, von Feuer, von Sturm, und stärker a vielu von Zeit. Es seien von mir durch die tausender Jahren die Maluches die Gräste gegangen verloren, die Völker die stärkste vertilgt geworden, und Weltstädte zerackert in Salz. Und riesige Berg seinen lang schon zerschotten, und ewige Wälder zerfeult und zertrotten, und mächtige Felsen zerweicht und zerknotten. Ich leb und gedeih noch als. Ich leb und ich will noch als leben durch tausender Jahren von Streit. Ich will noch als leben und kämpfen und streben, und Temp ist der Zorn von der Zeit.
Himl auf grenzt dem letzten Weg, euch immer neue, verstellen neue Weg. Blumen werden auf unser ausgedenkte Schau. Es wird heute unser Volk, wir sein ein Lob. Blumen werden auf unser ausgedenkte Schau. Es wird heute unser Volk, wir sein ein Lob. Baum des weißen Land von Schnee. Wir kommen an mit unser Kleid, unser Weg. Und ungebaut ist das Schloss von unser Blut. Schlossen wird auf unser Blut, unser Blut. Und ungebaut ist das Schloss von unser Blut. Schlossen wird auf unser Blut, unser Blut. Die Morgens und da bilden uns der Heim. Und der Merken wird verschwinden mit dem Feind. Da heute zusammen wird die Sonne in Kajor. Die Farvos und jenes Lied von dort zu kommen. Da heute zusammen wird die Sonne in Kajor. Die Farvos und jenes Lied von dort zu kommen. Das Lied geschrieben mit Blut und nicht mit Wein. Es ist nicht ein Leben ohne Freude, Leute frei. Das Opfer kommt zwischen Frauen mit Gewinn. Das Lied gesungen nimmt Vergangenes in die Hände. Das Opfer kommt zwischen Frauen mit Gewinn. Das Lied gesungen nimmt Vergangenes in die Hände. Das ob nicht einmal zu gehst den letzten Weg. Von Stimmen meine Verstellung, wo ihr